people.
34 people now,
Yeah,
35.
yeah. Yeah, it'll pile up quickly, that's for sure.
Okay. Yeah.
Do I hit this thing continue?
Uh,
This meeting is being recorded.
Yeah, no, you're good. That just, makes you
yeah.
official. Okay, guys, so I'm gonna start letting everybody in. Maybe, Mark, Barry, if you wanna put yourself on mute. I think you can come off of it if you do that, or if you can just, yeah.
Okay, here we go.
Okay, so we're gonna go live here, guys.
Okay.
I'm gonna let everybody in. Okay, Barry, I'm gonna do a sound check. If you can give me a thumbs up, that'd be good. Perfect. Okay, everybody. Well, I want to be the first to welcome everyone to the Peninsula at Home Virtual Enrichment Series on this lovely rainy Thursday. Couldn't think of a better evening to be spending on this topic. And for all the veterans in the audience, thank you for your service. It's been a wonderful Veterans Day week, and really appreciate what you've done for our country. This is going to be a fun evening for all us military history buffs with our special guest, Don Miller. And before I formally introduce Don, just a couple meeting logistics. You guys know the drill. You got the three amigos hosting you again. We're going to keep everybody on mute during the call, but you can submit questions online via the chat. My esteemed colleagues, Mark and Barry, will be monitoring that activity. We'll save a couple minutes at the end for kind of an open Q&A. So on to the formal part of the introduction of Don. And Don, I hope you're not going to blush. You've been through this so many times. I'm sure you could recite this in your sleep. But
we can keep it short too.
Yeah. Well, I'll do that. So Don is an amazing person, to say the least, and he's a professor of history emeritus at Lafayette College in good old Pennsylvania, and an award-winning author of 10 books, the most recent of which are VICKSBURG, which it just happens that I have here because I'm one of those fans. And this is a kind of a feature on kind of the unknown or less popular campaign that Grant led in really breaking the Confederacy. And one of his other most recent books is The Master of the Air, which is very cool as well. And this is talking about the American flyers, the bombers, in their fight against the Nazi Germany during World War II. And this one's pretty exciting because this is going to make its way to a television series co-produced by Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg. So Don is also a film co-producer. He's a historical consultant for over 30 film documentaries, including the likes of Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks' HBO Pacific series and soon to be released Master of the Air. And probably most importantly, Don and his wife Rose are part-time residents of the peninsula. So he's a neighbor amongst us. So how'd I do there, Don? Was that okay?
Good, that's good.
Okay. So Don, maybe as a starting point, it would be great to hear a little bit about your backstory. How did you get into history? Your passion to get into journalism. I think you're probably sick and tired of talking about all the details of the book. It'd be nice to hear how you got there.
Yeah, that might be interesting. Well, shout out to everybody, and thanks for showing up on this miserable night. Geez, I hope Donald isn't watching because I don't have a collared shirt on, but I guess we'll let that fly. First of all, I wasn't trained academically as a military historian, and didn't even consider myself a military historian until I wrote my first book on military history, which wasn't until 2001. I had already done 6 books before that. And it was largely the kind of haunting memory of my relative service in the war. I grew up in Reading, Pennsylvania, a railroad industrial. Used to be a center, a railroad industrial historic spot now in Pennsylvania. Tough, gritty, but really interesting town. And my father served in the war in the Air Force. My uncle was with the 16th Infantry Division, which landed on the first wave at D-Day. They were with the Big Red One. They had served in Algeria, Sicily, Italy, England, and then of course Normandy. And he served right through the Hurtgen Forest, the Bulge, and across to the Elbe. My other uncle flew B-29s in the fire raids against Japan. And I mean, our whole community, we lived in a little Slavic Irish community, and Memorial Day, Veterans Day was a big deal. All the guys from, my dad was president of the Catholic War Veterans. They'd march down the street up to the cemetery up by the old battery factory and shoot the 16-gun salutes. And this was great for us kids. And so, the war was woven through my life. And my mother was a war bride, and she was a Rosie the Riveter. She worked in a factory, an airplane factory actually, and was featured in one of the magazines as the prettiest girl in the plant. You could do that back then, have contests like that. And my grandfather made steel at the local steel mill for Patton's tanks. So we were into this thing. And after the war, I grew up in veterans housing. And I remember on Mondays was washing day and all the women were out there. It was largely Air Force, and they all had their husbands' flight jackets on. You could tell when mom was out there. And I remember going to the local theater and seeing the Glenn Miller story. And I with my brother and my parents. And I asked my dad, I said, is that real? Is there Glenn Miller? He said, yeah, he played, I heard him play during the war. And he said, I'll tell you something else. The guy who played him, Jimmy Stewart, he was a real life hero. He flew 32 missions in the war. And he went in when he was in his late 30s. I said, wow. And then, of course, the big revelation was going up in grandma's attic. And during the war, when I was an infant, my cousin was an infant too at the time. My aunt lived with my grandparents, with her parents, my grandparents. My mother lived there. And when I look back at the old pictures, it was on the home front. It was a woman's war. So that interested me as well. All the pictures, there's grandpa standing by the tree and he's surrounded by women and babies. And that's the world they grew up in. And then my brother and I got up in that attic and we pulled out flight jackets and gas masks and pistols, and we played Army and all that. And I used to watch Victory at Sea, but then it all kind of disappeared. I mean, I got interested in other things. In high school, I was a dud. I was interested in games and girls. And in college, I became interested in knowledge, but I became interested in the history of philosophy and history and ancient history. And those are the things. I didn't read any military history. In graduate school at Maryland and at Yale, I didn't take any military history courses. I came on it very late. I was teaching at Lafayette College. I had been at City University of New York and Cornell before that. And I watched Ken, like everybody else did. I watched Ken Burns's Civil War series, and I was mesmerized. And I thought, I got to learn more about this war. And I started reading ferociously about it. And I got curious about Vicksburg because Ken skipped by it so fast in the film. And I had done some work with him before that on other films. He did some of my books. And so I went to Vicksburg, and I was entranced by the location, the geography. I'm always interested in place, a sense of place, placing my characters in certain locations. And Vicksburg is visually very impressive. It's during the war, it was a city of 4,200 people sitting high above the Mississippi. It's considered and was called at the time a citadel city, 17 miles of gun pits along the river, defenses to the back, the Yazoo Delta running all the way up from Vicksburg to Memphis, 250 miles, the majestic mile-wide Mississippi. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do Vicksburg. And I rented a It would have been my first military history book, and I rented a boat. I stayed for long periods. Rose came down with me sometimes for 3 weeks at a time, and then back home. And other times I'd stay there by myself. And I usually begin in the field. I go to the battlefields. I go to the sites. And with the Air Force, I couldn't do that, but I went to the veterans and I went to their air bases in England. And I still give World War II tours for the World War II Museum. I'm on what is essentially their trustees. And I do a lot of trips around the world like this. I take groups on these trips, and that's as close to the war as anybody's going to get, going to those old bases, which are lovingly preserved by the English, the old towers, and the airstrips are still there. Some of the people who were kids at the time have resurrected these places and built museums in the towers and things, and they adore the American Airmen. In fact, when my book Masters of the Air was published in England, they didn't call it Masters of the Air. They called it 8th Air Force. And I asked them why. And my editor said, well, hell, everybody knows the 8th Air Force over here. Nobody knows it in the United States. They saved our country. And so there's a real appreciation for Americans and the American effort still in England at the time. So I launched into Vicksburg, and while still, being, drawn to this air war through my father's experience. But then I hit a dead end because I started to be overcome with a real sense of guilt about not writing about my dad's war. And I put the book aside and didn't come back to it until 2011. And around 9/11, the World War II Museum opened up, and I became involved with that through Stephen Ambrose, the great historian. I knew Steve from the Aspen Institute, and where we were both fellows. And he had also studied at Oxford, where I had done work in England. And Steve opened a museum that is now one of the great American monuments is the great American monument to the war, the official, America's official World War II museum. And I've been heavily involved with that ever since. That's where I met Hanks. That's where I met Spielberg. That's where I met one of my best friends, Nick Mueller, who after Steve died, 2 years after the museum opened, I became really close to Nick, and he's the one who's taken the museum to the moon. So I still go down to the museum every year and meeting historians down there. We have a thing called the Presidential Counselors, which is a group of historians, archivists, museum directors, people from the Smithsonian, people like that. You just exchange ideas for 2 days. It's wonderful. And you get some great ideas for books. You can play off your ideas with others. So it becomes a social experience as well as an intellectual experience. So that was good too. So I wrote my first book. It was called The Story of World War II. And then I got interested in the Pacific. I got a call one night from Steve Ambrose. And Steve said, I hear you're working at PBS on a film on Ulysses Grant. I said, yeah, I'm writing it. We're almost done, Steve. He said, I'd like to see it. I said, oh, as soon as it's in the can, I'll send it to you. He said, when will that be? He said, 3 weeks. He said, that's too late. I said, well, when do you want it? And he said, how about 2 days from now, maybe tomorrow. So I took a plane down, and a little later, and I think on that one Rose went with me, and Steve met me at the museum with his wife and took me in another room, and he said, I'm a dead man. I got 2 months to live, cancer, throat cancer. He smoked like a fiend. And then he took me over to his archive, which was at a place called the Eisenhower Center, which is connected to the World War II Museum. And he said, go through these files. He said, when I finished Band of Brothers, I was inundated by letters from guys who fought in the Pacific who said, why don't you do us the way you did the guys in European theater? And I got over 10,000 letters in here. Not just letters, but memoirs, diaries, and letters written during the war to the home front. And I said, yeah, I'll go through. I stayed for a while. I went through them, and he said, they're yours. We'll photocopy them for you. He's a very generous guy. And when it came time for us to leave New Orleans, I went to pay my bill, and it was paid. And he said, the only thing I want you to do is call it D-Days in the Pacific, because I'm doing an exhibit. It's my last effort for the museum called D-Days in the Pacific. And I want, the book to match in some ways the exhibit. So I wrote that. And then I got on to the Air War, and that was my dad's war, and I was pointing toward that one all the time. And and I'll stop talking here, but this was really terrifically important in my life. How are you going to meet these guys? Well, you go to the best way to meet them en masse is to go to their meetings. The 8th Air Force outfits are broken up into bomb groups. And a bomb group is, take an average Air Force base, 2,500 guys, and they stay together after the war as a group and have reunions. And they had a reunion this time of the entire American Air Force. Paul Tibbets, who flew, of course, the atomic bomb mission against Hiroshima, they was there. And I ran into a guy named Robert Rosie Rosenthal, and he just blew me away with his modesty and his intellectual power and his strength. And let me just tell you one story about Rosie, and then we can go into something, we can continue this through questions. But Rosie was a poor Jewish kid from New York, lived near Ebbets Field, big Dodger fan. He was an All-American, Brooklyn College, where he went, had a football team. He was an All-American football player and an all-city baseball player. And went to law school, graduated from Brooklyn College of Law, and then came Pearl Harbor. And he, at the time, he had a terrific job on Wall Street. And he signed up on Pearl Harbor Monday and went over to Europe in '43 at the height of the air war when we're losing to the Luftwaffe. And the losses were staggering. That's another thing that drew me to the topic. I'm interested in the Marine Corps for a lot of reasons, but 19,600 Marines were killed in World War II in the entire war in the Pacific, from Guadalcanal to the gates of Japan. 19,600. 26,000 airmen were killed flying out of England, and 21,000 were prisoners of war. 76% of the men who flew those missions those bomber missions over Germany. Yeah, they hurt the Germans, but they got hurt too. 76% of these guys were casualties. So they're flying suicide missions. Well, Rosie flew 60 of them. You only had to fly 25, and you could go back to the States and train other airmen. And he was shot down 3 times. The last time he was shot down, there was a firefight between the Russians, the Red Army, and the German Army, and he landed right in the middle. And of course, the Russians are our allies. And he's in a foxhole, and these Russians come straight at him with their winter hats on, with a red star on them, and he thinks, they think I'm Wehrmacht, I'm German. So he got up and he said, I said, what'd you do? He said, I did something crazy. I just started yelling, Coca-Cola, Lucky Strike, Yankees. And he said, yeah, okay, I'm American. And they took him back to Moscow and got him back to the States. He wanted to fly again. And when he went home, when the war was over, he said, that job didn't mean a damn thing to me. I couldn't get into it. Compared to the war, it was nothing. Nothing was more absorbing than the war. And so I got back in it. I'm a lawyer. I figured I'll go to Nuremberg and take part in the trials as a trial lawyer. And the way over, he met a young Air Force nurse, and they fell in love. Rose used to kid around and say, I didn't know whether I was in love or I was seasick. But anyway, he got over there, and he and Phyllis fell in, they were in love already, and they married in Nuremberg during the trials. And Rosie tried Generals Keitel and Jodl, 2 of Hitler's nodding donkeys, and as I call them. And he said, with that, I had closure. Phyllis was pregnant. The war was over. We beat the Nazis, and we did something about it. And he came back, and he never wrote a memoir, never wrote about his war experience. And he's one of the most decent human beings I've ever met. I thought, I got somebody in this. You're always looking for one little thing that can light a book up. And his story, I think, was the spark for me to get me totally absorbed in the book and to keep me grounded. And because he lived through the entire production of the book, and I could always call him. He didn't see its publication, unfortunately, but I'm very close to his family. And he's going to be a feature character, the feature character in the film we're making with it's a stream film. It's not really a film. It's a 10-hour, 10-part sequel to Band of Brothers and the Pacific, two films that won us, over 31 Oscars, so Emmys, and so we have a good budget for it. Band of Brothers Pacific cost 200 million. An average Brad Pitt film would cost 86. These films are expensive to make. Our budget's 300 million. So we have the money to do it. And Hanks has told us at our first production meeting, we have a director, we're on site in England, building sets. We're in Czechoslovakia filming. We've done all the special effects. So we're getting along there. And Tom always says to us repeatedly, if this isn't the best movie on World War II, I don't want to make it. And I want to make it with fidelity. Nobody in this film exists fictionally only. What happens in this film has to have happened. It may not happen exactly to the same guy, but it has to have happened. And all the characters are real names, people who actually existed, even though it's a dramatization. That's pretty hard to do. And I think he's pulling it off. Yeah.
That's amazing, Don. And I just that personal view of the war has got to be, it's got to feel like a privilege to you to hear and understand those stories firsthand, but then to craft them into a film. I think it's just so powerful. I traditionally do the for Veterans Day, we'll spend time watching rewatching over and over again Private Ryan, Saving Private Ryan.
Yeah.
And I know you were an observer for that.
Yeah, just an observer. I went over one time on my trip to England, and I was so struck because Tom is an actor and Spielberg's directing it, but they were filming, well, that unbelievable 21-minute opening segment, and they wanted to have it look as realistic as possible, and actors just weren't turning out right. In fact, Spielberg mentioned to me that when they started filming, they get a Marine Corps drill sergeant that he works with on all his war films, and he kind of whips the actors into shape. And he took them, including Hanks, out into they were filming in Ireland along the coast, out into the wilderness there, and they camped out in the pouring rain, damp night like this, and for days. And as big an opportunity as it was, all three of the actors actually, or the four actors, said, "We're out of here. We can't take it anymore. We're going crazy, and we're cold, and we're going to die. And so we're going to take a vote." So they voted, and four of them voted to go, and Hanks voted to stay. So then they changed their mind when he voted that way, and they came back. But what he wanted to do, they came back, and they met one of the actors, and who was dressed up, and he had on a $2,000 suit, and he had beautiful shoes on, and his hair combed perfectly, and they wanted to have these guys hate him because he was going to play Private Ryan. And nobody who landed on D-Day wants to go search for goddamn Private Ryan. They just want to live on the beach. So they hated him the whole film, and they didn't have anything to do with him. And but it made the film realistic. And one scene that really struck me is a couple of guys lost their legs at the landing, and they were bleeding profusely, both legs blown off by mortars. And they used fake blood and prosthetics. And Steve, 2 days later, put together another shot. And in this shot, he actually had guys who were incapacitated, who didn't have legs, who were veterans. And they came on set. Now, they didn't use real blood, but it looked a lot more realistic. These guys looked like people who knew how to handle, a situation like that. And we used Irish troops because we were throwing around live explosives, and the Irish police were pissed, and they're observing this operation. But it was interesting to see him try to get it just right, and to see his and Tom's continuing commitment. Tom, more than him, keeps getting drawn back to World War II. If you've seen Greyhound, and there's going to be another one after that in addition to our film. And we're going to do a documentary too. As we're filming the drama, we're going to do a World War II Air Force Air War documentary that brings in the Royal Air Force and the operations of the African-American flyers, and maybe even the air war against Japan as well. So we're planning that right now. That's fun. It keeps you going, because writing is a hermetic thing. You feel like a monk, or a hermit. You're in your monastic cell and you're alone a lot. And it's nice to take a break and mix with people on sets, and even today on the phone. We have these Zoom sessions, and they're raucous. It's a very different world than academe. If academic professors talk to each other like we did, nobody would ever go to a department meeting, because it's pretty rough stuff. But everybody forgets it after the meeting, because we're in a common enterprise, not like a bunch of petty academics, trying to scratch each other's eyes out for promotion and tenure. And we'll go down and have drinks and laugh it off. And we got to make a good film. And people just get a little hot when it's not going just the way it's supposed to go.
Yeah, I was going to say, you kind of opened that up a little bit. I'm sure a lot of people would love to hear just what it is like working with Spielberg. Obviously, his attention to detail and being accurate, and Hank's, as serious as he can be, he was always, had such a humorous side to him. I'm sure you have to have some stories you can share with working with those two characters.
Well, yeah. Tom's a voracious researcher, as is Steve. They know a lot about this stuff. And we had him here, Rose and I had him to the house in Easton. We were going to do a planning session, and I said, well, why don't you come here? And so he flew into Easton in a blinding snowstorm, and he flew in his own plane. And when I went over to pick him up, we got a car, we went over and picked him up, and he had 2 suitcases. A really tiny suitcase with his clothes in it, a huge suitcase filled with books. And he had the latest, as far as I knew, and I keep up with this, the best, latest books on German history, modern German history in World War II. And he'd read them all. And he said, look, I got 1,000 note cards here. I want to go over them this weekend. Holy God, 1,000 note cards. And we did. But we were having breakfast the next day. We had a cocktail party that night. And we had breakfast the next day. And I said, I got to go. And of course, you can't have breakfast with him out in a restaurant. So I got a local restaurateur to just give us a back room, and we went there rather than disturb Rose. But so I said, I got to go. He said, what are you going? I said, just a couple hours. I got to go teach a class. He goes, where's that? I said, right around the corner. Lafayette's right here. He goes, can I go? I said, sure. He goes, how about if I go and you don't go? I said, well, that's okay too. So I found this out later. I walked him over to the building, and he said, just let me alone, okay? Come in about 15 minutes, which I did. And apparently, according to the students, what he did is he walked in, he said, my name's Tom Hanks. Miller's got a hangover and I'm taking over the class.
I'm sure they would appreciate that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they got a kick about that, and then he stayed for pictures with them after class, and hired a couple of them as researchers too, down the line. So
Yeah.
he is really, the kind of guy you expect him to be, even in formal settings. He received the Legion of Honor, and the highest award given by the French government. And we went over to the ceremonies in Paris with his family, and even there, I mean, he was the life of the party. I mean, he's got a great sense of humor and tremendous humility. Yeah, and he wants to know a lot about his actors. He wants to know a lot about the people who work around him. He does an interesting thing. He has a driver, but he doesn't have a big car. He's got a little car. And it's an electric car, and he's got this driver, and he gives the driver books on movies that he's making, and he asks the driver questions, and he fires these drivers if they don't know the answers, because he wants somebody interesting to talk to in the car. And It's, that's how devoted he is, I think, to his craft.
Yeah.
At the same time, he can be really tough. I mean, one of the things that slowed us down in production is he's interested in film history a lot, and that and the history of space, but film history. Stanley Kubrick is a hero of his, and especially space movie. And Kubrick had a practice that was interesting. Before he had his script writers do the scripts, even the preliminary script, he would do something called a Bible. And it was a book literally on the movie, what the movie was about. And according to tradition that I've heard, Kubrick's books could be 150 to 200 pages. So Tom hired our speaker to do our original, I should say, not speaker, our original producer and director, to do in cooperation with myself and somebody else, to do but he did most of the work, to do a Bible. And I was in Florida with my granddaughters, following them around Disney World with my credit card. And he called me up. He called me up and he said, "Throw the Bible away and fire so-and-so." I go, "Oh, year and a half work. And this guy's doing a good job." "No, I don't like it. I don't like it." Well, that held us up a year and a half. And he said, I'll bring him back into the production later. But right now it just isn't, it's not bad. It's just not what I want. And so he can be tough without exchanging a harsh word or raising his voice or anything like that. It just didn't fit with what he thought the film should be. Yeah. And we writers have to be aware of that kind of stuff too. I mean, with us, it's like filmmakers, I really have learned a lot from filmmakers, and I hope some of them have learned a lot from me, but we have to move stories along. We're storytellers preeminently. I think good historians are storytellers. And good historians have to use all the methods of filmmaking and fiction, atmospherics, tension, indeterminacy, surprise, and all the things you look for in a good film or a good drama. And only we have a liability, our readers know, if we're nonfiction writers, know the ending. So how do you build suspense into something that somebody knows the outcome of? Yeah, Grant beat Lee and the Civil War was over. But building that in is probably the hardest thing to do in a film. Everybody knows we landed on D-Day and won it. But I'll tell you, you watch those first 22 minutes in Private Ryan, and you see that it would have been easy to lose that war.
Oh, yeah.
And I see that in a lot of things. I'm writing books on the Civil War now, and I see that there were as big a battle as Vicksburg was, decisive, absolutely decisive in winning the war. Grant said it was the most important battle of the war. Still, the Confederacy's fighting on, and they had opportunities to win it in the 1864 election if the country had elected George McClellan, who wanted to pull out of the war and allow the South to hold on to its slaves. This was a war for, you talk about the last election being important, this was a war for national survival, whether it's going to be the United States of America, and whether there's going to be a Southern Confederacy, and whether slaves are going to be free. So although you know what happens, you have to, there's suspense behind this, because it shifted all the time. It could have been lost. As late as the summer of '64, Lincoln was absolutely assured he wasn't going to win the Civil War, and wrote a letter to that effect and sealed it and gave it to his cabinet. He said, "Open this up after the election. You'll get a sense of how I feel right now in August, before the November elections."
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think kind of shifting gears a little bit to your point about Grant, and I pale in comparison with my understanding of the war, but definitely a big fan of it, and was always very impressed by the Southern generals in particular in terms of their competency and capability, and Grant never really got a lot of credit, or at least in my opinion, early on until the end. But kind of curious to hear, what did you learn differently writing Vicksburg about Grant, and even
Well,
Sherman.
a lot of things. I mean, his story is unbelievable in and of itself. I mean, he's shelving goods in a hardware store in 1860, and 4 years later, he's commander in chief of all United States armies. And he's been in 1860 drummed out of the army for drinking, and is working for his father as a stock boy. I mean, a year later, he's a brigadier general. 61, 62, he takes Donaldson, gets the name Unconditional Grant. Next year, he takes Vicksburg, decisive. Then he goes up and takes Chattanooga, comes east, fights Lee, and takes a surrender at Appomattox. And a couple of years later, he's president of the United States. 8-year period from a washed out captain. So it's a great story about resolve, because he's fighting two battles. He's fighting the rebels and he's fighting the bottle. And he was an alcoholic, and he couldn't hold his booze. That made it tough. I knew a little bit about that. My father was the same way, and my father kicked it, and in the same way Grant did. But it took a long time, and I know what kind of struggle it was. And Grant would have moments when he'd succumb to the bottle, and then he'd pull out of it, and didn't drink during battle. But there's a story, for example, that becomes almost apocrypha, that Grant never drank around his wife. That was true, but that he never drank when he was close to a battle or if something big was impending. And I found out that was dead wrong. There were moments in the war, once in the Vicksburg campaign, when the enemy was very close and threatening his operations and his army at Vicksburg, when he went on a wild 1.5 day bender. He also drank during the Virginia campaign. So a little bit more of that than I thought, but I thought his resolve was really unbelievable. And he hedged a little bit at times but this doesn't diminish him. I say hedge because when he was trying to take Vicksburg is a long campaign, 18 months, and it covers geographically 850 miles. And so it's a hard place to take. And he's not only taking Vicksburg, my book's about taking the whole Mississippi Valley from Southern Illinois at Cairo to New Orleans. That's a big job, to open that river to the farmers in the Midwest and make it from a rebel to a Yankee river. And he fails again and again and again. And Lincoln's wondering about it. And Grant's writing back after he's losing consistently, and he's shading his casualties. He's not reporting catastrophic losses. He did the same thing in the Virginia campaign, because I think he feared that with the drinking charge getting thrown around all the time, that he could be replaced. And it's likely, I think, historians hate to use words like likely, but I'll use that here. I think it's likely that if he had been in the East, where there was a lot of press coverage, much more of war, much more than out west in Vicksburg, he'd have been removed. And in fact, Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War at the time, that was the President's Secretary of Defense, there's a letter at the Library of Congress. It's the beauty of going to original sources. And it's typed out and it's signed by Stanton, and it's calling for Grant's removal. And Lincoln changed his mind at the last minute, because he's the only one who's winning victories out there. But that surprised me. And the other thing that surprised me was, in addition to fighting a war, Grant is fighting he ignites a social revolution, where the bottom rail is moving, out of its immiseration, namely chattel slavery. He frees during the campaign, while he's fighting battles day after day, he manages to free 100,000 slaves and put 26,000 of them in Union Blue. And he did it not because he was a flaming abolitionist. He was kind of indifferent about slavery until the war was at least a year old. But the whole story of Grant, and the soldiers were participating in this with alacrity, with energy, and with enthusiasm. And it all came to me in one letter I found. That's the beauty of going to archives. I went to 51 archives for this thing, from New York to LA. And in one archive, I forget which one, there's this unbelievably revealing letter from a Indiana farmer who writes his son, after the Emancipation Proclamation is is announced on Jan 1, 1863. And that's when really Vicksburg gets heavily underway. And he says to his son, boy, you come home. This war ain't your war anymore. You didn't go down there to fight NIGGERs, that's the word he uses. You went down there to preserve the Union, and now it's become a war against slavery. And I know you don't want to be part of it, and I don't want you to be a part of it. And his son writes back, hey, Pa, I'm staying. And I've become a military abolitionist, he used that word. And he describes how he's seen slaves building forts. Confederates forced them to build forts for themselves, cook their meals. All the officers had servants, cleaned their guns, grew cotton, which was sold for armaments, which they used against the Yankees. And every slave, he tells his dad, that we take from them, we hinder them, we hurt them. This is the only thing that's really hurting them. We burn their farms, destroy their plantations, the cotton gins too, take the slaves, take the hogs, take the pigs, take everything, and strip them of their subsistence. And this is what's going to really hurt them. They can't live without slavery. There are letters back where they describe Southern women who'd never made breakfast in their lives. And they're in their 40s and 50s, didn't know how to. That's how pampered they were. And Grant opposed this policy originally when he went into Mississippi. He and Sherman, of all people, said, we're going to hang soldiers who enter Southern homes or burn domestic, any kind of, domesticity, you stay away from. You stay focused relentlessly on, the economic infrastructure. Well, the troops went crazy. They're breaking into liquor cabinets and jewelry and everything else. So it's anarchic. And Sherman doesn't want this. He's a man of order. He wants the Army discipline. We got to go into Mississippi and win a big battle. We can't have all these slaves around. They're going to hurt us. So what Grant did, he took the slaves and that he freed, and he set them up into contraband camps, they were called. And they weren't behind wire or anything like that. They took over abandoned farms. The rebels got out of their way wherever they went in Mississippi. The Southerners just abandoned their homes, took their best slaves with them, that is, their slaves that get the most work out of, and left the older slaves and the very young kids at the plantation. So the Yankee soldiers could just take over the plantations, set themselves up there, and then have the slaves work the cotton, put in the crop, and harvest it for pay. And in addition, they would receive food and clothing and tools from the US Army. And the troops that Grant was freeing and making soldiers would guard the plantations. So in this way, Grant was able to fight a disciplined, focused, sharply focused war and still uproot slavery in Mississippi. When he's done in Mississippi, there ain't no more Confederacy in Mississippi. There's no cotton oligarchy. It's gone. The novel that really does that most compellingly and influenced me a lot is, I'm a big Faulkner fan, is Absalom, where a self-made planter goes into a town near Faulkner's home in Oxford, which is not far from Vicksburg, 130 miles. And with a bunch of itinerant workers, namely 14 slaves he brought in from Haiti. He had been an overseer in Haiti. He builds a shack, really, a big shack, which he's going to turn into a plantation mansion. And when it's finished, it doesn't have doorknobs or chandeliers or rugs or anything. So he sends the slaves in wagons down to the river. They flag down boats and they buy chandeliers and furniture and paintings and hangings, brings them back, goes into town, marries a local prominent woman, and they're plantation grandees. This all happens in a 10-year period between 1848 and 1860. It's 12 years. That's the South that fought the Civil War. That was another revelation. It's not the South of Margaret Mitchell, with the crinoline, skirts and the verandas, and all the other stuff. It's not Margaret Mitchell's South, it's Faulkner's South. And Faulkner describes how this guy with his slaves went into swamps, naked, all of them, 14 slaves and the white guy, and they would coat themselves with clay, naked, top to bottom, coat themselves with clay to keep off the mosquitoes, and they worked like that to build the plantation. That's why the South fought so hard. this is a world they built. It reminded me a lot when I did my Chicago book about Armour and Field and Swift and Pullman and those early so-called robber barons who built these big, efficient industrial complexes, and Carnegie and Steel and things like that. They opposed unions because these were family firms and they had built them with their own money, and they didn't feel that labor had a right to share in that. And that's how Southerners felt about their farms. And then when they thought about those Yankee depredations, you know, going into homes and acting like, in their words, Visigoths and Huns, they had motivation to fight. And I tried to take the story into side Vicksburg. There's a 47-day siege, and into the minds and homes of people who were under bombardment during the siege, living in caves throughout the siege, people outside Vicksburg who were in the way of Grant's army and got swept up in the fury of those raids, and the anger. As Sherman says, wars don't slow down. Wars accelerate. The worst part of any war, witness Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the worst part of any war is the end, especially when you're fighting an enemy that won't surrender. And then it has to become what the Civil War became, a war of annihilation. And that's what World War II became. So you learn a lot about that by going into these records. And that one letter led me in all these manifold, you know, directions, you know, and you try to find evidence for it. And I found thousands of letters like that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating. We can go forever. We'll do this over dinner, but you know, the whole how do Sherman and Grant, you know, two very dominant players, not real communicative, you know, how do they?
Yeah. How do you do that? I mean, I think, you know, I think, Walt, we miss a lot of this because the kids do. Certainly I did. I was a terrible high school student and I had terrible teachers. What a combination. And the way it's taught, I mean, here's the Civil War, and they'll teach you the causes and the consequences, but not the fighting. And to me, that's a big part of the story. A lot of people say, "Oh man, I don't want to get involved in, or I don't want to watch movies that are violent and things like that." And I would just want to read you 3 sentences I wrote a long time ago that I just found today about this very thing, about against teachers who don't want to teach blood and guts. I say it isn't scholarly and it's unseemly. So screaming 19-year-olds that go charging into sheets of fire and are turned into ooze become cold statistics in the textbooks. This is not simply bad history. It's an insult to the men who died. War is about human beings killing and dying, and it's these men, not the generals, who decide the fate of battles and of entire war. They deserve our consideration at the moment of their greatest peril, when they put all on the line. And that's why you want to do combat history. And also, I think to myself, and I don't want to run on here too much, what kind of world did I grow up in? Well, it was the 50s, and it was shaped by not who won World War II necessarily, but how it was won. Look at the Eastern Theater in World War II. Germany invades the Soviet Union. Pell-mell, they're at Moscow, they take Leningrad, they almost take Stalingrad. Then the Germans turn it around, and it was vicious. You know, roughly 14 million German women are raped in their march to Berlin. They take Berlin, and they ain't leaving. This is the Iron Curtain. This is the Berlin airlift. And that's the Cold War. Poland, Austria sucked into the Soviet Union. And okay, that's the world I grew up in. In the Pacific, it's the same thing. Forget about the debate on the bomb. You can't understand the bomb unless you understand the savage fighting that took place to get to a point where we could fly planes into Japan to deliver the bomb, and how much we lost and how difficult it was to defeat an enemy that believes in emperor worship and the disgrace of surrender. And so it's a war of extermination.
Yeah.
And well, how did it end? We thought the only way it could end by dropping 2 atomic bombs and shocking them into surrender. And that's the world I grew up in too, not just the Cold War, but the atomic age, diving under the desk when the alarms went on, and things like that, worrying about the spread of communism. And that was shaped by the way the war was fought. Look at those wars in the Mideast today, the way they're fought with a viciousness like that and the residue of hate that it leaves. They never end. Oh, do wars ever end? Will Durant once figured out, I don't know how the hell Will Durant figured this out, but he said, to his estimation, there are 100 days in human history, okay, when there was peace on Earth. So we live inside a world of war.
Yeah.
Going on all the time.
Yeah, that's a sobering statistic, to say the least.
It is.
Well,
and I get interested in it naturally because I'm not interested in the bullet by bullet stuff necessarily. I consider myself, like I say, a historian of warfare, which has ramifying effects on society, on politics, on refugees, on cities. 61 German cities turned to cinder and ash in the war. It affects everything. It triggered the end of the Depression. It accelerated the Civil Rights Revolution. I mean, it just has, I like to spread it out and deal with the social ramifications and cultural ramifications of warfare as well as warfare itself. And I think that's where my book differs from my books differ from other military history books, from a lot of them. There are a lot of people who do go into this, some good ones who go into this sort of stuff. Yeah.
No, very, very good. Okay, well, I promised we have some Q&A. Mark, Barry, I'm sure there are a couple questions sitting out there in the chat. Maybe you want to.
Yeah, we do have a couple of questions. The film that you were talking about at the beginning, Don, when is that scheduled to come out?
I wish I knew. COVID. We got set up and built an airstrip and a cutaway of a B-17 and a control tower and a hospital. We hired the best set designer and costume designer in Hollywood. The uniforms are made and everything else. As I said, we did the special effects, and then all of a sudden last July, they closed us down and for like 6 months. So we're back working again, and we expect to start serious shooting in February. And it's not going to take that long once we get on set because we've done the Bible. The beauty of the Bible is if we've already hired a director. If you ever see the film HBO True Detective or watch the new James Bond film,
Wow.
We've got a really good director for the first 3 episodes, but he'll do 3, somebody else will do 3, and somebody will do 4 as directors. But they'll all know what's going on, so we can film simultaneously. And so it keeps the actors on set. We don't have to keep bringing them back. It's less expensive, cuts down on cost. So Spielberg works at warp speed, and Tom does too. Not as fast as Clint Eastwood, but he does movies in 3 weeks. But it'll be out next year.
Don, Dave Stahl asks or makes an astute observation and asks this question: how do you take this film, World War II, and communicate with younger generations who did not live through this, and make it relevant to young people today, also to understand the relevance to our country today and our future?
Yeah, it's hard. I think you just tell it like it was. Here's a little parable that drives that point home. I had a student, I was supposed to interview a bunch of Battle of the Bulge veterans in Allentown, which is close to me. And they were having a picnic, and I couldn't go. We had a death in the family. And I sent my research assistant, 19-year-old woman, to interview these vets. She was scared to death and she didn't want to go. When she came back, she said it was the greatest experience of her life. And she said, as she started talking to these guys and they started talking about coming out of high school and getting drafted right after their prom and things like that, and their girlfriends and writing home and fighting. And she said, I saw them not as 87, but as 19. And that's how these guys are going to appear in the film, as 18, 19, and 20-year-old people facing these unbelievable challenges. And when you deal with things like what is fear, everybody thinks about that. And how do you combat it? Will I hold up under stress? War is all about the application of stress. The side that applies the most wins. And what are you fighting for? And does that matter? And well, it doesn't matter when somebody's got a gun in your face. You're thinking about your life, but it does matter when you settle down and think about why you're here and what it's all about. But I think that's how you do it. And we were able to do that very successfully, especially in Band of Brothers, where most of our following, and we still have fan clubs, our Band of Brothers fan clubs. When I saw the actors for the first time traveling, I was in Normandy with them, and it was 2 years after they made Band of Brothers. These are the actors, okay? Okay, that was okay. Then we brought over the vets, the actual guys, and Winters and those guys, They were rock stars in France, absolute rock stars, jammed, autographs, clubs, everything, packed. I think we can do the same kind of thing here because of war. Finding it was right. War is a children's crusade. It's where, as Herodotus said, it's where fathers bury sons, and that ain't right. And if that can't come through to people, I don't know what quite can. Yeah.
Yeah, that's you point out. I think in the book the youth. Anybody that grew up on watching older World War II movies, where the actors did not look anything close.
No, it didn't.
But,
William Holden in Battle of the Bulge.
Yeah.
And he won it single-handedly.
I mean, these flyers, these kids that were flying these bombers were what? They 18, 19, 20.
Yeah, one guy said he looked in a mirror one morning before a mission at 4:30 in the morning, and he was shaving, and he thought, wait a minute, it's January 28th. Second semester sophomore year begins at Syracuse. I'm supposed to be in History 202. Another guy I talked to said, end of my sophomore year, I start working a summer job, and it's June, and in August, and he said, I'd never flown in an airplane before. And that's June. That's September. He was flying a B-17 over Newfoundland up on what was called the Circle Route through the Arctic to Scotland with 5 crewmen through an ice storm. You learn quick. Or a friend of mine, Paul Sawyer, who was a navigator at age 19 and a half, trying to get not just one plane, but a squadron of 12 bombers to the target. And if they miss and they run over Ak-Yak, an aircraft fire, they're all lost. What response? I don't think ever has so much responsibility been placed in men so young. I'm familiar with infantry and Marines and how they fight, and they're led. And these guys weren't led; they were the leaders. And there was no radio communication between the base and the plane. You went into a briefing in the morning. That's the first time you heard about the mission. They put things up on the board: altitude, where the enemy guns are, the route you're taking in. And you sat there and believe me, you paid attention. That's a college class you paid attention in. And then you went out, and maybe you saw the rabbi or the priest before you went, and he'd come out and bless the plane or say a prayer over the boys, and off you went. And the next time you're in communication with anybody who resembles a general is when you come back. So yet they flew 999 missions and they never had one turn back. So a lot of them shot down, but not one turned back voluntarily by enemy resistance. So they did pretty good. And they were a true band of brothers in those planes, 10 guys tied together by hoses, oxygen hoses. And breathing through those things, they put them on at 11,000 feet. We idolize these mountain climbers. Shit, come on. You gotta have millions of dollars to be a mountain climber, and then you get paid bounties to do it. These guys were getting paid $3 a day to fly, an aluminum capsule over Berlin with 600 German guns and 200 German fighters coming at them.
So what was the in a bomber? What was the most dangerous position?
Pilot, by far.
Really?
The Germans, you think it would be the underside of the plane, the ball turret gunner, because he was in a rotating ball that was made of plexiglass. It wasn't, none of the windows in the planes and any of the visible protection was bulletproof. And guys could freeze in there if they had electric suits. If the electric suits short circuited, like the old Christmas trees used to do, one light goes out and the whole thing goes out. And but the pilot, because the Germans learned, they used to fight coming up in the rear and attack the rear of the plane, but it took a while to get up there like that. You're struggling to climb. They would climb above the bombers and get in formations, maybe 12 abreast. And then they'd fly out of the range on the starboard, on both sides of the plane, okay? And to psych the guys out, because they couldn't reach them with their machine guns or 50 gals. And then they go past the planes and go out in front of them about 2 miles. And then they'd come in. Now, a plane coming in at 2 miles like that with closing speeds of 600 miles an hour, 300 the bomber, 300 the plane, takes about 3 seconds. So you look on the wall, you see a speck of a little fly or something, and that flies in your eye in 2 seconds. So, and they aimed for the front of the plane because the propellers are there, the gas tanks are on the wings, and the pilot and co-pilot are in an unprotected cockpit. So that's what they went after. Wow. And and by far pilots, were at the moment, even more than the navigator or the bombardier. The bombardier was in a very precarious position over the target. When he had a machine gun, but he had to put it aside and look through his so-called Norden bomb sight, which is a pre-computer type of bomb sight that the Navy had used for sighting and the Air Force took over. And he had to look down into that thing, straight down to the ground, 20,000 feet, and keep his eyes on the target and fly the plane. The plane steering mechanism, the steering would be transferred to him. So he'd guide the plane to the target and drop the bombs. And when flak is bursting, flak being an aircraft fire, if a flak shell hits the plane, it's gone, it's immolated. But the flak would explode and shoot out hundreds of shards of metal, sharp metal. And the planes are only made of aluminum. You could take a screwdriver, and a strong man could drive a screwdriver through the fuselage of a B-17 or B-24. So you have that flak flying in front of you, clouds of it. So thick, the airmen used to say you could walk on it. So you couldn't look up at the flak, nor could the pilot, who lost control of the plane, take evasive action. The whole purpose was to get the bombs on the target, and you had to fly right into the flak. When they first started bombing, they all took evasive action. Then Curtis LeMay came into it, and he's a tough commander, and he said, well, guys, it is dangerous to fly into the flak, but then you don't have to go back again as many times. That wasn't convincing, by the way. Not between the flak and the fighters. They once put up a sign, a poster in one of the barracks. It said, the Germans had a really good plane called a Focke-Wulf, and one of their fighters, it was better than the Messerschmitt. And the Air Force propaganda sign that kids confronted when they went in the barracks said, who's afraid of the Focke-Wulf? And all 25 guys signed, I am, on the poster.
Yeah. Very good. Well, I want to be respectful of time. We kind of went over time a little bit, but I think I speak on the part of everybody that this has truly been engaging, and your depth and history and storytellings in particular, Don, are wonderful. So I want to thank you, from the bottom of our heart.
It's been a pleasure, and thanks for the questions. They were very good.
Yep. No, that's good. And then I just, in closing, we'll open it up as we normally do to have everybody applaud you personally. But I wanted to put in a shameless plug for reminding everybody of our nonprofit organization. It's called Warrior Community Connect, and it's dedicated to help the local Delaware-based wounded, injured, and ill veterans and their caregivers, transition back to civilian life. So if you want to get involved in the current day help, happy to send some information along that line.
That's a terrific organization. I first met you all at one of those meetings.
That's right. And I appreciate all your support, and anybody who wants to get involved, we'll send out information after the fact. So with that, I'll open it up to the group for the appropriate in-person thank you, and stay tuned for the next series of enrichment series that are to be posted. Barry, I don't know, when do we have the next one? Barry, Mark, do we know what the official next event is?
Sort of towards the end of this month, beginning of December, the tech Christmas tech gifts.
Oh, there we go.
Right. And then Thanksgiving with Carolyn.
Yeah. At some point, we're trying to sort that out.
Perfect. Well, anybody that wants to unmute themselves and send their thank you, please do. If not, we'll make it a wrap. Yep. Thanks, Don.
Thank you.
Be safe, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.